stuff. So we are in chapter 5 today. Chapter 5 is interesting in Mark because this entire chapter is devoted to 2 stories, possibly 3 on the second half of the chapter. There's kind of a story inside of a story, but it really, as the way the chapter is arranged, we've seen Mark in these first 4 chapters give us lots of short stories, and here we get expanded stories, much longer than we've seen. And so we'll actually break this first one down into 2 days. We'll talk about the story itself today and then the implications tomorrow. This is a strange story. It shows up in other Gospels. It's not one that makes a lot of sense instinctively or naturally. But let's get into it, and then we'll stop and talk about it. So, chapter 5, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and they stopped. When they stopped the boat, immediately a man came out of the tombs who had an unclean spirit and met them. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Let's stop there, Michael. So, a very troubling beginning to a story. What looks to us as through modern eyes as maybe some form of mental illness or some deep psychological brokenness, and then to hear the reaction. And, you know, obviously the intent is to keep this man from hurting himself, but the idea that he's been chained, that he's been shackled, that he roams the countryside hurting himself, that people don't know what to do with him, that he's simply out there, a wild man, living this very sort of wild lifestyle, or this kind of very ragged existence. And when he sees Jesus, he runs, and we see this, you know, we've seen this before. The unclean spirit confronts Jesus, or Jesus, we're told, has confronted him. And the man, in his voice, speaking for the spirit, says, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Which is a profound question, and not to divorce this story from the spiritual nature of it, but if I was preaching this story, Michael, I think this question would intrigue me. What have you to do with me, Jesus? Ultimately, maybe that's the intersection of the Jesus stories.
Right. And Clint, I think you've already named, but it's worth fleshing out a little bit more. I do think this story is a great example of how some of our concerns that we bring to a story tend to cloud us from seeing what the story really was intended to convey. And if you come here and you see this man, there's really this very imaginable imagery, this person being restrained with shackles and chains. And you can imagine those chains that are laying on the ground that have been broken. And this is very much a sort of cinematic telling of a story like this. And so to a modern reader, to someone who's engaging this, who's used to watching cinema and TV, and we can conjure these images, I think we do get drawn into, well, what's wrong with this man and the image of his suffering. But what I think you see right from the beginning of this story, if you look at verse 3, this man lived among the tombs. No one could restrain him. No one literally had the strength, either physical or the mental power, to be able to somehow come up with a solution for this man. And so this man is let loose. He's roaming. He's free. He's wild, right? And what you're going to see in the midst of this miracle is Jesus once again being portrayed as the one who has authority and strength. Jesus is the one who arrives and is able to bring peace where there has been no peace. And we're not quite there yet, but I think the point of, once again, Jesus being named is important, because once again, it's a question of who has authority in this circumstance. Is it the demon who can name Jesus, or is it Jesus who arrives on the scene? And we are now sort of geographically moving beyond that initial place of Jesus's ministry, where Jesus was staying in that Galilee kind of region. We now see it moving out, and we see that authority and practice in these other places.
There are a couple of ironies in the text that I'm not sure are intentional, but they are interesting. The first one is when we see these images of shackles being broken, chains being broken, we are conditioned to equate that with a good thing. The idea of being let loose seems to us to be a wonderful thing, a good thing. When we undo the shackles, let go of the chains, break free. But freedom, when we are unhealthy and broken, is not productive. That's not a good. In fact, it's a more dangerous situation for this man that he is free than when he is restrained. And so there is a subtext here about what is the true nature of being set free that I think is interesting and would be helpful to explore if you were digging into this text deeply. Secondly, the spirits, we're going to learn in a moment. I'm jumping the gun here, but we're going to learn that it's the spirit having conversation with Jesus. And so when he says, I adjure you by God, in other words, this spirit says, it calls on God's name and says, do not torment me, when this is the exact thing that the spirit is doing to the man. And the selfishness of evil, the selfishness of brokenness that would visit upon this man, quote unquote innocent man, torment and this lowest of all existences, but then would then beg for mercy and say, but don't do that to me. This is exactly a parable that Jesus told about a man who was forgiven a debt, but then wouldn't forgive a debt. And we see here, I think, something about the nature of evil, Michael, and the nature of selfishness, even though it's put here in kind of the spiritual realm.
Yeah, I think image that comes to mind as you share that, Clint, comes to me from C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. He's recounting there a demon who has sort of become part of a person's life. And he recounts in that story how this angel recounts to this person, if you want to be free of this demon, all you have to do is say the word. And that person's unable to do it because this demon has become so part of who they are. They promise security. They promise accompaniment. They promise support. And it's sort of going back to that old adage, the devil that you know is better than the devil that you don't. There's a sense in which the very thing calling out to God, don't do harm to me, is the thing that tends to do harm. And that isn't just allegory. That's true. Anyone who's reflective knows that the greatest temptations in our own life and the lives of those around us are the things that promise us the most. If we believe that a thing is giving us freedom, to use that as an allegory, if we believe that this demon frees us from the bondage that we have, we'll be blind to the bondage it inflicts upon us. And one of the great prayers I think we as Christians seek to offer is, Lord, open my eyes to see what is true. Because so often we're blinded by that thing that tempts us or by that addiction that's clouded our vision, and we're unable to see its effect in our life.
Mm-hmm. Let's continue then. Jesus continues this conversation. What is your name? And he replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and they were drowned. This is an important part of the story for one textual reason and one kind of maybe scholarly reason. The textual reason is that when you see a reference to a great herd of swine, you now have to, at least it should pique your attention that we may not be in a Jewish story. As the Jews wouldn't eat pork, as it was one of the foods that were unclean, they certainly didn't farm them either. And so we learn from this that we are probably in a Gentile region or a Gentile area at least. And whether or not that means this man is Gentile, we're not sure, but certainly this area. And in the back part of this story, as people have conversation with Jesus, we may be seeing the first time in the gospel that Jesus has kind of interacted with Gentiles. And if so, that's remarkable in Mark for how early it happens and how cleanly it is woven into the story on the front end of the story and not down the road as it tends to happen a little bit more in the other Gospels. The other thing that's interesting is geographically, this story doesn't make a lot of sense. The area that we think Jesus is in, called the Gerasenes, is about 30 miles from the nearest bank that would go over the cliff and into the sea. So there are those who said, well, the swine ran 30 miles. There are those who said, well, we have the name of the town wrong or the town changed names. Again, I point that out because it's of interest, but when we get bogged down in those details, we tend to miss what the story's saying. But nevertheless, it is interesting that the earliest hearers of this would have wondered what cliff these pigs are running off. But of the two, Michael, I think that's far less important. And the idea that there are Gentiles present may be more stunning.
Right. I think we, by nature of how we're going to study this, are kind of breaking this into two pieces. This is connected to the conversation that we're going to continue tomorrow when we finish this story. But needless to say, I think you can really divide this story into two major movements. The first part is an establishment of the characters and the different, I don't want to say values, that's not the right word, the characters and their struggle for authority. Who has authority in this circumstance? The second is going to be what happens when the ultimate authority is brought to bear. And it affects every character in different ways in the story. So we won't jump into that in particular, though in Mark, we very much have this theme of the Gentile-ness of this story has implications for the witnessing of who Jesus is following it. But more on that tomorrow. I think suffice it to say for today, what does matter is that you need to recognize here that no Jewish person feels guilty for that swine herd, right? That we, even in our own knowledge here, most of us know someone who is connected to that industry. If you live in the Midwest, we have some connection. And, the idea of this entire herd being wiped out would be horrible news. But to a Jewish person, that's great news. I mean, see you later. To a Gentile, that could be your entire economic hopes for the year, right? So I think what is important to recognize is that there is this sort of conflict that happens in the story. It's Jesus and Legion, as we're told, but this is also has some impact on the people caring for the swine. It has an economic impact on their life, and it also has an impact on this man's life as the demon is taken from him, and we'll see what that looks like tomorrow, how it changes him. So I would just say in general, this is true of all the Gospels, but I think maybe this story tells it very clearly, Clint. There's always in an encounter with Jesus, the person you were before Jesus and the person that you are after Jesus. And this story, I think, portrays that in just striking detail, that all of these characters in some way, even the people caring for this herd of swine, they're all impacted in some meaningful way in their encounter with Jesus. And it's never an encounter that you would miss.
Yeah, those are good words, Michael. And there is an appreciation in the Middle East for stories in which somebody gets outsmarted or outwitted, and the sort of trickster theme is important in Middle Eastern stories. And from a Jewish perspective, this is a win-win. From a Jewish perspective, Jesus does two things here. He tricks the demons, and he destroys a herd of what are unclean animals. And so rather than be like the idea that, oh, Jesus destroys these people's livelihood, the idea would be, no, Jesus tricked the demons and got rid of everything that was unclean before God in one fell swoop. And so while I'm not sure this is a Jewish story, the Jews hearing it would have appreciated it on both of those levels. The idea that Jesus not only got the best of the demons, but he also got rid of some pigs in the process. And so that's a good insight, Michael. We're going to leave the story there for now. Tomorrow we look at before and after. Tomorrow we look at after, what happens after this exorcism and the aftermath of this man's story. And in some ways, he is a tragic character in the beginning of the story. In tomorrow's part of the story, I think he's very much a fascinating character, and we will look into that tomorrow.
All right. Well, that's today's study, friends. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, 2:00.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally. But be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2:00 Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.